Paul Lafargue was born in 1842, the son of a Bordeaux landowner. He was trained as a doctor in his young life, but his focus began to shift when he met Charles Longueuil at school, who would eventually become his brother-in-law. Longueuil introduced him to the philosophy of Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, who is considered the father of anarchism, and this led Lafargue to a long life of interest in radical leftism. In 1866, while at medical school in England, where he was studying because he was banned from studying medicine in France, Lafargue joined the International Working Men's Association, which was a multi-tendency leftist organization that was originally founded for the purpose of uniting interests of unions internationally in order to help avoid the shipping in of foreign workers for strike-breaking purposes. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels were both members of the International Working Men's Association at the time, so when Lafargue arrived, he and other Proudhonists kind of formed their own faction and quickly began to push back against the more established Marxists in the group. Proudhonists disagreed with nationalization as a leftist tactic and generally eschewed using the state as a means to bring about a socialist revolution. Karl Marx wasn't very fond of this new faction, and he pretty much openly made fun of them. That still didn't stop his daughter from marrying Lafargue in 1868. Paul became a doctor in that same year, but this profession lasted less than 5. However, he continued to work in leftist circles. In 1871, he joined the Paris Commune, setting off a point in his life where he generally struggled to find work and bounced around various leftist causes. In 1880, partially inspired by the publication of Engels' Anti-Düring, as well as a growing demand in France that laborers had a right to work, meaning that they deserved what they considered fair employment, Lafargue penned a pamphlet titled The Right to be Lazy and published it in a newspaper called L'Égalité that he had been running. In Chapter 1, Lafargue berates the working class for valorizing work and accepting it as a fundamental good. He recognizes that work is not always fundamentally bad, but under a capitalist system there's not much benefit to doing work. He calls work in a capitalist society the source of intellectual degeneracy and organic deformity. This is followed by a quick overview of historical and religious examples of people avoiding work, which Lafargue presents in contrast to modern working class demands for steady employment. In Chapter 2, Lafargue begins by discussing historical examples in which capitalist philosophers or rulers have theorized that work is good for people as it stops them from being lazy, which is undesirable because that leads them to desiring things like independence and freedom from want. This, Lafargue argues, has had the effect of beating the working class into submission, forcing them to work long hours for little pay, and leading them to become so disenchanted that they consider a law limiting the workday to just 12 hours to be liberating. All the while, this work in growing industries has made laborers sick and weary, and the capitalists have trumpeted this horn of progress, but the workers see little benefit of that, having been worked so hard and paid so little. Lafargue argues that poorer, less industrialized nations often bear people who live more comfortably because their work is only done to sustain themselves rather than to accumulate productive capital for the business owner. He refers to capitalist economic booms as pretended prosperity because they are built on immiserating the working class, who then cannot provide demand to stimulate the economy, which subsequently collapses. He goes on to say that it is wrong for the worker to demand a right to work in these hard times, as it is work that got him into this position in the first place. Rather, the worker should demand the ending of his poverty and hunger. In recessions, there is often a surplus of goods and a lack of demand, but rather than distribute the goods directly to the public, the manufacturer sells what he can and then dumps the rest to avoid depressing the value of his goods too far. Thus, scarcity is manufactured and is ensured that people must work for the capitalist in order to survive. This need to sell goods is also a driver of imperialism, as capitalism creates the need for ever-expanding market to sell the vast overproduction of goods. Because of this relationship between work and the perpetuation of capitalism, Lafargue argues that working people should not demand the right to work for a fair wage, whatever that means, but rather for the right to be lazy, or freedom from wage slavery entirely. Chapter 3 begins with Lafargue pointing out how automation has made work thousands of times more efficient, yet this has done nothing to reduce the labor expected of working people. In exchange for fair pay, their ever-increasing production has only led the ruling class to grow hedonistic and overconsumptive. Lafargue goes on to criticize how much work is done strictly in the name of sustaining bourgeois lifestyle, estimating that more than half of labor expressly exists to produce goods and services for the incredibly rich and no one else. He also criticizes the working class's response to this bourgeois laziness and hedonism, which is largely focused upon demanding that capitalists also work, rather than that the working class no longer be required to work. The attempts to force work on the capitalist class have largely resulted in increasing of policing of labor and legal protections for capitalists. This, Lafargue points out, has just created more unnecessary labor for the working class to do. Since the overall result of this pointless labor for no wage is the reduction in demand and the overproduction of goods that the working class has no need for, the bourgeoisie also seeks to persuade working people that they have needs for goods that are not necessary. Otherwise, the market for said products would not be salient and the bourgeoisie could not enjoy purchasing them. Simultaneously, because all of this overproduction has devastated the availability of raw materials, the quality of goods rapidly trends downwards. From here, Lafargue argues that capitalists themselves are proponents of limiting the length of the workday because the productive capacity of people is so large as to dwarf the actual demand for goods produced. Thus, the capitalists must avoid overwork not because of the weariness of the workers, but to avoid suppressing the value of their sales. This is compounded by the fact that workers grow tired after 12 hours of labor, and thus the efficiency of their work is eventually diminished to the point at which it's not really even worth paying them, right? There's a limit on how much work a person can actually do in a given day. In chapter 4, Lafargue roughly sums up the cycle that he has outlined thus far, discussing how first, goods are overproduced, necessitating an artificial increase in demand that generates the need for more work by laborers, which leads to a surplus of available labor, which then leads to the capitalists condoning the limitation of how much work can be done. Lafargue then predicts that bourgeois tastes have something of a trickle-down effect, as the ever-expanding market requires ever-expanding demand, which must be instilled into the working class. In order to counteract this, he demands that people take up the cause of a work-free society, which then he sort of humorously speculates on the nature of. So what is the takeaway here? Lafargue is arguing against incremental gains which are won by playing the capitalist game. He's arguing that the very concept of being made to work for pay is an artifact of the capitalist system and thus it must be done away with. Obviously the idea of a completely work-free society is somewhat impossible, but Lafargue's point is that one should negotiate based upon your ultimate goal, rather than coming to the bargaining table already having compromised your ethics. He thinks that the vast majority of capitalist production is unnecessary, and that if workers were able to seize the means of production, we could live in a perfectly stable, progressive society with a tiny fraction of the labor currently being done. To apply this to a real-world situation, we could say that the demands of a train conductor, for instance, whose job is to be cut, should not argue for the retention of their job, but the continued payment of all workers at the same level for half of the labor. Arguing otherwise is a partial capitulation to the interests of capitalists who want people to keep working for the same lower pay. So I really recommend The Right to Be Lazy. It's got actual jokes in it, and the writing is very common in its language. I think Lafargue is a great writer, and it's very entertaining. I hope you give it a try, and if you do, happy reading.